Hi everyone, this module is going to cover the evolution of management theory. Before we get started with the lecture and get into that, for this particular module, I want to encourage you to go out and watch this video. I'll play it here as part of this lecture. But just to give us a background into the Industrial Revolution and how it's going to relate into what we're talking about today. So we need to build that foundation to better understand where we were at and how we got to where we're at today.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to discuss the series of events that made it possible for you to watch Crash Course, and also made this studio possible, and made the warehouse containing the studio possible. A warehouse, by the way, that houses stuff for warehouses. That's right, it's time to talk about the Industrial Revolution. Although it occurred around the same time as the French, American, Latin American, and Haitian revolutions between, say, 1750 and 1850, the Industrial Revolution was really the most revolutionary of the bunch. No way, dude. All those other revolutions resulted in, like, new borders and flags and stuff. We've studied 15,000 years of history here at Crash Course Made from the Past, and borders and flags have changed plenty, and they're going to keep changing. But in all that time, nothing much changed about the way we disposed of waste, or located drinking water, or acquired clothing. Most people lived on or very close to the land that provided their food, except for a few exceptions. Life expectancy never rose above 35 or below 25. Education was a privilege, not a right. In all those millennia, we never developed a weapon that could kill more than a couple dozen people at once, or a way to travel faster than horseback. For 15,000 years, most humans never owned or used a single item made outside of their communities. Simone Bolivar didn't change that, and neither did the American Declaration of Independence. You have electricity, Industrial Revolution. Blueberries in February, Industrial Revolution. You live somewhere other than a farm, Industrial Revolution. You drive a car, Industrial Revolution. You get 12 years of free formal education, Industrial Revolution. Your bed, your antibiotics, your toilet, your contraception, your tap water, your every waking and sleeping second, Industrial Revolution. Here's one simple statistic that sums it up. Before the Industrial Revolution, about 80% of the world's population was engaged in farming to keep itself and the other 20% of people from starving. Today, in the United States, less than 1% of people list their occupation as farming. I mean, we've come so far that we don't even have to farm flowers anymore. Stan, are these real, by the way? Can't tell if they're made out of foam or digital. So what happened? Technology. Here's my definition. The Industrial Revolution was an increase in production brought about by the use of machines and characterized by the use of new energy sources. Although this will soon get more complicated, for our purposes today, industrialization is not capitalism, although as we will see next week, it is connected to modern capitalism. And the Industrial Revolution began around 1750, and it occurred across most of the earth, but it started in Europe, especially Britain. What happened? Well, let's go to the top level. The innovations of the Industrial Revolution were intimately interconnected. Like, look for instance at the British textile industry. The invention of the flying shuttle by John Kay in 1733 dramatically increased the speed of weaving, which in turn created demand for yarn, which led to inventions like the spinning jenny and the water frame. Soon these processes were mechanized using water power until the steam engine came along to make flying shuttles really fly in these huge cotton mills. The most successful steam engine was built by Thomas, they didn't name anything after me, Newcomen, to clear water out of mines, and because water was cleared out of those mines, there was more coal to power more steam engines, which eventually led to the fancying up of the Newcomen steam engine by James I Got a Unit of Power and a University named after me, Watt, whose engine made possible not only railroads and steamboats, but also ever more efficient cotton mills. And for the first time, chemicals other than stale urine, I wish I was kidding, were being used to bleach the cloth that people wore, the first of which was sulfuric acid, which was created in large quantities only thanks to lead-lined chambers, which would have been impossible without lead production rising dramatically right around 1750 in Britain, thanks to lead foundries powered by coal.
Okay guys, I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. You can finish watching the rest of the video at your leisure, but just wanted to kind of set us up and give us a little background into what we'll be talking about today. And how the Industrial Revolution relates back into management theory. So after you watch the video, if you went back and watched it, you may just be thinking, what does the Industrial Revolution have to do with healthcare, have to do with management in general. And it's important to understand and note here, the Industrial Revolution really changed the way we saw the role of a manager. We saw the manager become more of a professional manager, not just managing over their own farm, their own, sharecroppers that worked under them, but now we're transitioning the manager into more of that professional role. And this may all seem really simple, why didn't, that simple, that's nothing new. But it's important to understand at the time, this was really unprecedented, and to think about, what organizations really existed prior to the Industrial Revolution that we could really base management off of. The only ones that really existed and were really out there were things like the government, military, different churches, and that's how, when the Industrial Revolution came through and we started to evolve management, that's why a lot of management and management theory and the way we do things is based on different things that we see in the military, the church, or the government, because that's how the structure was based, because that's what we knew, that's what existed at the time. So over the next couple of slides, we're going to be talking about different schools and thoughts of management, different theories of management. Now they are going to be very, very academic, very textbook heavy, so they can be a little tedious, but just stick with me on it. We'll work through it and talk through it. I'll add a couple things that are supplemental into your textbook in regards to a couple of the different theories. But it's again important to note that, as organizations were starting to form, we'd never seen anything really like this. We'd seen it loosely constructed, but we're starting to get this more formalized organization coming together. So there wasn't much precedent past how we do it in the government, how we do it with, in that church, religious structure, how we do it with the military. And so that's why you see a lot of the same language, a lot of the same lingo used in government and military used within the management structure, because that's what we based it on. But as we go through and talk about these different schools of management, these different theories, they all revolve around, what is the best way to lead people? And that's what I want you to think about going forward as we work through this. So as we start out, we're starting out in the more classical area of theory regarding management. So we're talking about late 1800s moving into the 1950s. And under this theory, or at this time, at this stage of management theory, we see, it may seem simple, but we started to note that money is what motivated employees. And how they gave their best output was tied to money. So we have this economic man concept, all revolving around money motivating employees. So we come to Henry Fayol, and he is often credited with coming up with the 5 essential functions of management. He's also termed the father of modern management, but he came up with these 5 functions that we discussed in the previous module, revolving around planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. And even though these are, they're probably about 125, 150 years old by now, these are still relevant in the workplace today, and things that we need to be aware of as we move forward, particularly if you see yourself going into a management or a supervisory role. So Fayol, in addition to his 5 essential functions, the planning, the organizing, the commanding, the coordinating, and the controlling, he had 14 management principles. And they all revolve around, again, what is the best way to manage? What is the best way to manage the workforce? And you can read through these different management principles, again, that were created by Fayol, who's often termed the father of modern management. So as we move into scientific management, you'll start to note here that it starts to overlap with the more classical management theories that we had just talked about, or that classical era going from the late 1800s to the 1950s. So we see kind of this overlap with scientific management from 1890 to 1940. So here we're looking at, or here this particular time era in management history, we're starting to, from the Industrial Revolution, we're starting to get more machines, more equipment integrated into the workplace. So now we have to start thinking, how do we integrate our workforce, our people, with these machines, with these equipment? How do we, continue to increase our profits, seeking that, economy of scale, economy of time? How do we increase profit, decrease our time, and increase our efficiency? So how do we bump up our human energy, make that more efficient, make sure that we're using it appropriately and getting out of it what we need? And time is money, so how do we decrease our time, still make quality products, still make things run more efficiently? So we have a couple of different people that were pretty prominent during this scientific management era. We have Frederick Taylor, all about scheduling and controlling. We have Franklin, Lilly, and Gilbreth. And what they did, it seems simple maybe. They studied time and motion analysis, but it was really groundbreaking and fits nicely if you're planning on taking quality improvement. The work of the Gilbreths really tie into what we see in quality improvement in terms of time studies, understanding the process, mapping it out. They would, for example, watch bricklayers, watch how they worked, what their process was, and try to come up with change management theories on, how do we decrease the time that it's taking so that we can increase the output that we're seeing and run more efficiently. And then the last one we'll talk about, Henry Gantt, all about scheduling. How do we schedule tasks? Gantt charts, which we're going to talk about a little on the next slide and throughout the semester. Very relevant, still used today, particularly in the military. We see that a lot. But just scheduling, how do we schedule appropriately to make sure we're using resources appropriately, we're not overloading one side or the other. So here's an example of a Gantt chart that I wanted to just show you that we could go over. And again, Gantt charts just assisting with how do we schedule tasks or events out to make sure that we're staying on time and that we are staying with pace that we need to finish the project on time. So you can see at the top there we have our time separated out. This particular one has it separated out in quarters. So we have Q1 through 4 with the appropriate months under each quarter. And then we can see there under project steps, the first one, explore the market needs. So we see that particular task or that particular step is going to take from about mid-January to early to mid-March. And it just gives us a quick visual on who's doing what. So we can see explore market need, that's the job of marketing. Anything in blue is going to be development, QA testing is going to be in red, and so on, so on. We can see when we meet major milestones. Just making sure that we stay on task so that we can finish in the time that we need to. The next kind of era of management we move on to is bureaucratic era of management. Now this runs 1930 to 1950, and this particular era focused heavily on rules and regulations, making sure that we're following that the different rules in place. But I want you to think for a second, particularly around the time that we see this kind of era come about in the 1930s and 1950s, and start to ask yourself, what was particular about this date range in our country's history overall? And if you said that, you're correct if you said, our country was involved in World War II at the time, and the events that happened through World War II, they significantly changed our structure as a country, the way we did things on multiple different aspects, and particularly in management. So through World War II, we've seen, you know, men typically were the workers of the household. We saw them become either sign up or be drafted into the war. So women would come in, fill the spots that were left vacant by those that were off to fight. When they came back, when the men came back from war, you know, some women were displaced, some went back to the home, some stayed in the workforce. And when the men came home, you know, they were really, they were really changed by everything they'd went through World War II. And they were used to the organization of the military and the level of organization that brought to them. And they brought that level of organization, that level of management structure to the workplace with them. So we started to see management firmly construct around different aspects that we see coming out of the military and out of the government structure. So we had Max Weber during this time, big believer in, you know, everything is ran by bureaucracy. It's the most efficient structure, and it's most efficient to follow the rules of law and rules of organization. So he defined three different aspects: rational authority, and these three different levels of authority: rational authority, which of course is based on law and rules and regulation. He also defined that we have something called positional authority, which is simply put based on the position that you have within the organization. So if you're the CEO, the COO, the CNO, the authority is based on the position you have. And the last one that he defined, pretty interesting, I think anyway, based on charismatic authority, so not necessarily tied to the rules and law, not necessarily tied to the position you have in the workplace, but more tied to your personality or the person's personality. You give a person, you know, very charismatically. I'm sure you've followed at one time in your life someone who's been very charismatic, very outgoing, and you follow them based on their personality within that situation. So right now we currently find ourselves in the human relations era of management theory. Now this again kind of overlaps with Bureaucratic Era of Management. So we see us going from 1930s to present to the era we're currently in now. And you know, this particular era relates back to having a workforce that's not necessarily as motivated by money, or that money is tied to employees' motivation. You know, it is, but this era and this management theory is saying that's not the only determining factor. Employees want something where they feel like they're adding meaning, that they're making a difference. They're motivated by culture, by the environment. They're doing meaningful work, and just all relating back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we're going to talk about later throughout the course. So just a shift in the way we start to think about things. Management, not necessarily tied to money, motivation not necessarily tied to money so much as, we want to make sure that what we're doing is meaningful and that we're going to be highly motivated by the culture and the environment that we find ourselves in. Next thing we'll cover in regards to management theory, we'll talk a little bit about the Hawthorne studies. So these were very groundbreaking landmark studies, and they may seem simple now, but at the time they were very, very, groundbreaking studies that were conducted that just said, people simply saying that people change their behavior around tasks, around things that they're assigned to do when they know they're being watched, which seems simple. I change my behavior when I know I'm being watched, but it was very groundbreaking at the time to understand that if employees have a watchful eye over them, they'll generally give their best output, give their best effort, and give you a quality product. I want to encourage you to go out and watch the Hawthorne Effect video. Now it's linked up here in the PowerPoint slide right here. If you click on Hawthorne Effect, it'll take you to a YouTube video. So make sure that you go out and watch that, learn a little bit more about the Hawthorne Effect and the studies that were conducted from that. Now, a couple of the findings from the Hawthorne studies just revolve around informal leadership and understanding that informal leadership does exist out there. And because we do have this kind of level of informal leadership, groups, the workforce, groups of workers are going to decide what their culture is, regardless of, any money that's tied to anything. Their attitude is going to be what is key to productivity, because they're going to set the tone for the culture and the environment that they're going to work in. A different video just regarding the Hawthorne Effect, I want you guys to go out and watch. Linked up here at the bottom, the Hawthorne Effect, the study of employee productivity. Make sure to go out and check out that link. So the Mayo the study that was done come out and concluded generally that the Industrial Revolution just changed a lot of things that we do. It changed the way we operate, changed the way we function as a society. And again, I've said it a couple times already, but it may seem really simple now, but that's because we've worked in it for so long that it's second nature to us. At the time, it was very, very groundbreaking. Think about the organizational structure that, didn't exist before the Industrial Revolution, and how society was set up. And then we had, this boom in industry and how that changed the way we do things. And then we find ourselves in World War I, World War II, and how that changed management for us overall. We had a loose structure, if you will, to management. And after these couple events that happened in our country's history, we started to firm up that management theory and the way that we do things and the way things are organized. But, Mayo concluded, too, that, again, through these Hawthorne Effect studies, that people's behavior changes when you watch them. Now, don't mistake that to mean that you just need to sit around and watch your employees all day. That's more micromanaging. That's going to, greatly disenfranchise your employees and create a less than hospitable work environment. But it's more important to just be present. Make yourself be visible. Be out there checking on your employees, checking on people who work for you, making sure they have the things they need. What assistance can you provide them? Not just sitting there scrutinizing everything they're doing, but making sure that you're getting out of your office. Now, we have an office when we when we work, because there are some things that have to be done in the office. But just make sure as you move into more of these management and supervisory roles from the administration side, that you are making an effort to get out there and understand what's going on with your employees. Don't just manage from a desk or manage from the boardroom or manage from the conference room. You need to actually get out there, see what's going on, see what changes need to happen, and see how things are happening from an employee standpoint. So we move into Barnard's acceptance theory of authority. And I want you to make sure that you know this theory very well, because you may see it again on a quiz or an exam coming up. But the basis of this acceptance theory of authority is that, as crazy as it may sound, managers are only going to have as much authority as their employees are going to allow them to have. Because, a couple slides ago we said groups are going to dictate the authority, or groups are going to dictate the culture, going to dictate the environment that they work in. And as a manager, you're only going to have as much authority as you're given by your employees. They need to trust you. They need to know that they can follow you, trust your decisions. So we have three basic tenets that we want to talk about from Barnard's acceptance theory that are important in this whole authority theory. The first one, you need to be able to make sure as a person working in a managerial or a supervisory role that you can establish and maintain that effective communication system. You know, how well do you communicate with your employees? Do you have an open door policy? Do you communicate very well with them so it's not perceived that you're, not necessarily trying to hide things? How do you get the information out to them, and how open do you keep those channels? You also need to hire and maintain that effective workforce. You want people motivated to be there in the case of healthcare, you want people there who want to be there to take care of your patients. So you need to make sure that you're hiring and maintaining that effective workforce. And then motivating your personnel that work for you, your employees, making sure that they feel like they're contributing. Because generally that's why we go to work, right? Because we want to feel like we're making a difference, and we want to feel like we're contributing to the overall bigger picture. So I have a couple of different theories, appropriately named Theory X, Y, and Z, very creative. But as you read through these theories, it may seem a little crazy to think, people actually subscribe to these theories, and the one that I particularly get stuck on is Theory X. I don't subscribe to this theory at all, that employees need to be directed because they're lazy and irresponsible. People do need to take responsibility, and I'm more kind of between Y and Z, I guess, knowing that people need to feel like they're responsible for making decisions. Again, going back to wanting to make, motivating your personnel, making sure they feel like they're contributing, and having more of that emphasis on quality improvement. How can we continually work to make this better for our patients? So as we move into the contemporary era of management theory, again, 1940s through present, we have a couple different theories that we're going to cover over contingency, MBOs, and organizational development. So we had Mary Parker Follett's law of situation revolving around contingency theory, basically just saying, there's no one right way to do anything. It's really just going to depend on the situation. And we see that out in the workforce. What may work for one doesn't work for another, but we can take different elements and adapt it to work for our needs. Now, I will tell you the management by objectives. Please make sure that you know this. This will pop up again on a quiz and an exam. So make sure that you are very, very familiar with management by objectives from Peter Drucker, just revolving around how we go out and set targets that are attainable for our employees, as well as managers that report to us, to making sure that we set them up for success. And then organizational development from Kurt Lewin, relating back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we'll get into in a couple slides and continue to talk through about throughout the semester. Now, if you don't work in healthcare, or if you do, I just remember thinking when I first started working in healthcare, how shocking it was how many departments there are that kind of try to work independently. But understanding that we have one patient that may go through all these different departments, emergency department, surgery, lab, x-ray, housekeeping, dietary, they run the continuum. So they're running kind of horizontal through these streams, and we try to set up these departments in silos. So how do we kind of make the systems function together for the purpose of the patient so that they have a smooth transition from one aspect to the next? So I said one aspect that I really want you to know we're going to focus in on is management by objectives for Peter Drucker. Management by objectives, and I would see this in healthcare. I would, complete this task with my superior. But just talking about how we as a superior, a manager and an employee that reports to that manager, or managers that report to higher ups, how we can work together to jointly kind of establish these objectives, so we don't feel like things are being forced on us, but that we're a partner in the overall structure of things, and how we can create these attainable objectives together. And most importantly, making sure, if you're taking planning, strategic planning, or if you have already taken strategic planning, we talk a lot about the mission, vision, and values of the organization and how crucial they are. So through creating these different objectives, we need to make sure as a manager, as a superior, as an administrator, that we're making sure that these objectives and these action plans that we have are going to be tied to our mission, vision, and values, and our overall business plan for the organization. Because if we don't, we don't need to focus on them if it's not going to ultimately push our mission, vision, and values for the organization. So I've got an example that I'll go over with you on the next slide. But we talk about, how do we sit down as a manager to a subordinate, a director to a manager, and create goals and objectives for our department that are attainable, and how do we make them SMART? Following SMART criteria: specific, measurable, attainable, reliable, and timely. How do we make them relate back to the mission, vision, and values? And oftentimes how we do that, and we'll talk about this a little more in the human resources lecture, but tying the performance on the objectives back to employee evaluation, so that they have kind of this push to want to do well, because it is tied to their overall evaluation within the organization. So here's an example of a structure that's used to kind of help create these objectives. So if we wanted to improve patient satisfaction from 89 to 92%, that's going to be our objectives. It's SMART, it's specific. What are we going to do? It's measurable. We see that we need to increase from 89 to 92%. It's attainable, definitely. We have a reliable way of catching the data, and it has that time factor in there, so we're giving ourselves until 2013 to complete this. Now the objectives, again, if you were in strategic planning or planning on taking strategic planning, you'll know that action plans overall, their purpose is to drive the achievement of the objective. The objective is to push the achievement of the goal. So the action plans relate back to the objective overall, and how do we set ourselves up, or what are the tasks that we need to complete to achieve this objective. And then you can see we have completion dates for each one and the different resources that we may need for each one to be accomplished. So Cartman and organizational development theory revolves just around the thought and the idea that, while labor, yes, may be your most expensive line item on your budget, people, your workforce, are going to be your most valuable assets, regardless of anything else. Your buildings, your equipment, they don't take care of patients. Your people take care of patients. And so they are going to be your most valuable asset. And so organizational development is just more of an organizational-wide management theory on how to manage your most valuable asset, your people. So we talk about organizational culture, and it goes a little bit beyond the shared values and beliefs of an organization. And here's a little test, just to make sure that you guys are not just skimming through these slides, but are listening to a couple little extra things that I'm adding in. Organizational culture it really refers back and relates to workforce diversity and the culture overall. The way we do things around here, how do we do things, how do we operate around this organization, and that style of managerial leadership, which can either sink or swim an organization. If you've got very supportive leadership, very, supports innovation, supports change, supports their employees and what they're doing, you're going to have a very successful organization. So just make sure to know the term organizational culture, because you will see it again. So as we move into the entrepreneurial era of management, starting in the 1970s, we talk about autonomy. And I want you to think for a second, what does autonomy mean to you? What overall does that mean, that word? People overall, if you were to go out and survey, they want autonomy in the workforce. They want to be able to have the freedom to choose. They want to be trusted with decision makings. They want that level of trust given to them. And it really does help with your retention of your staff overall if they feel like they're being trusted to do the right thing. And it's important, particularly in healthcare administration, to have this level of autonomy and understand why autonomy is important to individuals, because as an administrator, as a manager, as a director, whatever leadership role you find yourself in, you are not going to have all the answers. It's almost impossible. You will not have all the answers to everything you need, but you do need to set yourself up to be able to have the people around you, or be able to rely on others around you to give you the information you need, help guide you in those decision-making processes. And making sure you set yourself up to have these people around you, because again, you're not going to have all the information you need in that setting. We've heard, if you work out, I'm sure it's ubiquitous between all industries, but we particularly hear this in healthcare a lot, especially when we're trying to do process change or change things. That's the way we've always done it. It's been done this way for years, and we hear it all the time. But think back to what we said about healthcare. It's dynamic, it's ever-changing. And you know what? When you hear that, when I used to hear that, it would make me so upset, because just because we did this one process this one way for 30 years doesn't mean it's the right way or the most efficient way that we need to do it. We're always changing. What is the best known way today may be different tomorrow. So we need to, as managers, as administrators, as supervisors, really encourage our employees and those working under us, and really coaching and mentoring those above us as well, to really think outside the box and be, the standard phrases, think outside the box, be really innovative, and how do you get ahead of the trends and ahead of the curves, and how do you adjust and adapt to this very rapidly changing, very dynamic environment that we find ourselves in healthcare. So just as a final note, to kind of end, this theory of management, I want you to go through and watch some of The Art of War by Sun Tzu, and see if you can pick up on what management theories are presented in there, particularly around something we're going to talk about later with HR, but how do you exercise discipline? So it's a good short little watch, linked up right here at the bottom, The Art of War. Make sure to go out and watch it.